Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're doing something just a little bit different. I've done videos ranking iPhones before in various formats, including a tier list, and so today we're going to do the same thing but for iPads. And I thought this would be interesting just because there are so many iPads, and we've seen a lot even this year. And if you've never seen a tier list, have you been on the internet before? Now, basically, it's pretty simple. It's like a report card. How this works is we just need to drag this little PNG here into one of the tiers. S is the best, F is the worst. So I actually made a template for this that everybody can use. You can open it up and follow along if you'd like to. It'll be linked in the description. I spent way too long making all these little thumbnails for all the iPads. There's a lot of iPads. I think there's like 30 here, something like that. And it's also a very confusing history. Like down here, you can see there's a pretty big jump, like iPad 4 2012, 2017 is the iPad 5. That's just because Apple has been pretty inconsistent with naming these. And we won't beat around the bush here. If you want to follow me on socials, you should go do that at 91_tech. And we do have a Discord, so maybe come join. That'd be pretty cool of you. As always, all that's linked in the description. But let's get this party started, shall we? So first up, we of course have the first generation iPad from 2010. Now, when we're ranking these, we can't rank these off of how they are today, because otherwise it would just basically be in descending order from how recent they are. So instead, we're kind of basing this off of their merits. How good of a device were they when they came out? How innovative were they? How long did they last? Were they fast on all versions of software? How many versions of software did they get? That sort of thing. The first iPad, of course, well, it was the first one. It was essentially an oversized iPhone, and it was pretty awesome. Kind of changed the world a little bit. And I think tablets were inevitable, but the iPad was definitely the first really good one. So I'm thinking B tier for the iPad 1, and it would be higher, except for a couple of pretty major flaws that it had. So it came out in 2010, and it technically had iPhone OS 3 when it first launched. They didn't call it iOS yet. That started with iOS 4, and then it only got until iOS 5. However, it was very fast on all of its versions. It just didn't get very many. But even holding it in your hands today, it really doesn't feel that old, or at least that different from a modern tablet. It's still ultimately a slab of aluminum and glass, right? You also, right out of the gate, had a 3G variant, which I think is cool. So overall, I'm gonna stick iPad 1 in B tier to start this, and then we'll come back and maybe reevaluate that as we go along. But yeah, next up we have the 2011 iPad 2. So the iPad 2 is kind of amazing, and the reason is because it came out a year after the first iPad. In fact, I think it was a little less than a year after the first iPad, and it managed to improve on everything. It brought the A5 chipset, which was in the iPhone 4S. This iPad actually came out before the 4S did, so it was the first to have that A5. It was slimmer, it was more comfortable to hold, it didn't have those sharp edges anymore. And I used the iPad 2 back in the day, and there's a lot of good here. It added a camera. You know, the iPad 1 had no camera, this one had one on the front and back. Terrible cameras, but cameras all the same. And perhaps most impressively, it got from iOS 4 to iOS 9, for better or more likely for worse. So iOS 9 on A5 devices like the 4S and the iPad 2 is very, very slow. It's an unfortunate reality, and even iOS 8 isn't very good either. And so it left a pretty bad taste in my mouth when it came to the iPad 2, which is too bad because it was a fantastic iPad. However, even though it had such a rough end, I'm gonna stick it in A tier. I'm thinking A tier, yeah, because it brought so much. There's also benefits to getting support that long, apps last longer, that sort of thing. So, also battery life was always really good. The batteries were so big in these old tablets. So I think that's worth an A tier. Again, we might reevaluate this as we go along, but let's go ahead and talk about the iPad 3. Okay, that's enough of the iPad 3. All right, no, okay, the iPad 3 came out a year after the 2011 iPad 2, and it brought for the first time the Retina display to iPad. The big issue is that's all it added. Now, having a Retina display on a tablet, very, very nice. Retina was, of course, just way more pixels, everything was crisp, there was no more blurriness. I never found the iPad 2's display that bad or anything, but compared to the iPad 3, it's definitely far behind. The problem is, beyond that, all they did was double the amount of RAM, and they also went to the A5X chip, which focused on the GPU and graphical power, which was going to be needed with the Retina display, which you would think would help with performance, but it doesn't really because it has to power that display, or at least not by a considerable margin, and so it's also very slow on iOS 9. I could live with that if it weren't for the fact that it was replaced like 6 months after it came out by the iPad 4, late 2012, and the iPad 4 was a lot better. It had the A6 chipset, same one in the iPhone 5, and it brought the Lightning port as well. The iPad 4 absolutely outdid the iPad 3 in every single way, and the iPad 3 was out for 6 months. I don't know why why they didn't just wait to release the iPad 4. I think it was a big fumble on their part, but the iPad 3 is without a doubt, in my opinion, the worst iPad of all time, just because anybody who purchased it, and there was a lot of people who purchased it, kind of got screwed over very quickly. The iPad 4 was just better, and it got to iOS 10 as well. It was a really solid iPad. There wasn't really any necessary flaws to it, so I'm going to stick it in B tier, because I can't think of anything negative about it at the moment. And then you've got the first generation iPad mini. That's right, we're moving on from the basic iPad line. This also came out in late 2012, and you can see this little picture here. That's the black and slate version. This would be replaced with space gray when they were still selling the iPad mini one the next year. What's interesting about this iPad is it actually pretty much set forth the standard design all the way up until pretty much today. The design of the first iPad mini looks very similar to even the iPad 9 from 2021, and this came out in 2012. This was before the iPad Air. This was when the iPad 4 still looks like that. I mean, look at that. It's like a picture frame in comparison. These aren't to scale, by the way, so. But yeah, no, the mini one was fantastic that way. From the design element, it was smaller, of course, which some people wanted, especially since Apple didn't have any real phablet options yet. For me, the iPad mini one is going to be A tier, and it's simply because that design was so ahead of its time. That's the main thing. Now, there's a few drawbacks to it. The camera wasn't great. It didn't have a Retina display, which I think is okay for what it was. It also had the iPhone 4S specs. It had the A5 chipset and ½ GB of RAM, which means, like the iPad 2, it would end really slowly on iOS 9, which is unfortunate. And Apple sold it for a long time too, so a lot of people ended up with pretty quickly slow devices. So that's the real pity with the iPad mini one. Otherwise, though, I do think it just set forth in motion so much good for the iPad line. I find it hard to not consider it to be one of the best. Then you've got the iPad Air 1. The iPad Air 1 is S tier. It was the first one to shake up the design besides the mini one, of course, which it really is just a bigger iPad mini one in a lot of ways. It was so much thinner. It was so much lighter. It was so much sleeker than the iPad 4. I remember when it originally came out, the commercial where it was like hiding behind a pencil because it was as thin as a pencil. Beyond just the design, it also completely changed the internals. It had the A7 chipset, which was the same as in the iPhone 5S, a chipset that would give it 6 years of support from 2013 all the way until 2019. iOS 12 today is still getting updates, security updates. It's old and it's probably not fast for most people anymore, but it's usable, and that is impressive for a device that is almost 10 years old. The Air 1 was an absolute marvel, and it is definitely held up as one of the best iPads of all time. So far, you might notice a pattern here. All these iPads have kind of been pretty high on the list, and don't worry, it'll be getting a lot more mediocre, but it's going to continue for now with the iPad mini 2. Solidly in A tier, the iPad mini 2 had a lot of the same benefits that the Air 1 had. The A7 chipset, it also brought the first Retina display for the mini line, which was big. The only reason it's not S tier is because the mini one set to that design the year before, but it ran up to iOS 12. It was fast throughout its life. It was just overall a very, very solid little tablet. And yeah, 2013 was a very good year for iPad fans, and so was about half of 2014. So the iPad mini 3 and the iPad Air 2 were released at the same time. We'll start with the mini 3 this time around. Now, the mini 3 is going to be E tier. And the reason it's E tier is because it wasn't a bad iPad per se. In fact, it was a very good iPad mini. The thing is, it was a good iPad mini because it was the mini 2. No, really, it was the mini 2. All it did was add a gold color and Touch ID. In fact, you know what am I saying? This should be F tier. It added nothing. And the thing is they still sold the mini 2 for like $100 less. All the mini 3 did was add Touch ID and a gold color. That's it. It got to iOS 12 just like the Mini 2 did. It's just pointless. It's very, very pointless iPad. They should have at least put the A8 processor in there or something. Luckily, the iPad Air 2 did improve things. Pretty massively, actually, which makes it S tier. The Air 2 was amazing. It brought the laminated display, which if you don't know, basically it fused the LCD and the top glass together, the digitizer. So there's no air gap. It feels like you're touching the display itself, not the glass above the display. And even today, some of the iPads, including the iPad 10, isn't laminated. The laminated display made it thinner. It makes it a lot harder to repair, which is a pain for enthusiasts, but otherwise it's better in every single way. The Air 2 also had the A8 chipset, as well as 2 GB of RAM, 2 gigs of RAM. The iPhone 6 at the time, the 6 and 6 Plus came out this year. They had the A8, but only 1 gig of RAM. That 2 gigs of RAM was huge, along with, actually, it was the A8X chipset. Let me correct myself. Somebody's already written a comment trying to correct me, but I did it myself, so beat you to it. So A8X as well as 2 GB of RAM got it all the way until just just a couple months ago with iPad OS 15. 8 years of software support. What do I even say? There's no other place you could put the Air 2 but S tier. Oh yeah, and it had Touch ID as well. I can't believe, see, there's just so much it brought. I almost forgot that. Yeah, it had Touch ID, which was obviously a lot nicer than just a regular home button. Well, let's move on from 2014 to 2015, iPad Mini 4. And basically, it brought the Mini to the level of the iPad Air 2. So it got the A8 chipset, not the 8X, mind you, the A8. But it did, however, get a full 2 gigabytes of RAM, which really helped it for longevity, to the point that it would also get to iPad OS 15, because of course it would, which for me puts it in A tier. It did have a laminated display, and of course Touch ID. If the Mini 4 had been the Mini 3, it had the same specs as the Air 2, but was small, it would be an easy S tier, but it's not. It's still got 7 years of support though. Not a lot to complain about. It's very much an A tier, and I'm sensing a pattern with these minis here. That won't continue. And yeah, so far it seems like I might be overrating these old iPads. Might have to adjust this. We'll see. Now there's one more iPad in 2015, and that's the first gen iPad Pro. Now this is where things get a little bit more difficult. I'm not sure off the top of my head where to put this. So this was the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and it was announced alongside the Apple Pencil. So the Apple Pencil is definitely helpful for the 2015 Pro. I can see the naming thing here is already a little confusing. The iPad Pro naming scheme is weird. It is weird. So the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, very large. Some people really liked that. Some people just didn't care. It had the A9X chipset. It still supports iPad OS 16 today. It also has 4 gigs of RAM. On paper, the specs are still fairly impressive. So for me, this is going to be a solid A tier device. And next up, we have the iPad Pro from 2016, specifically the 9.7-inch model. Now this one is, maybe I could have combined it with the 2015 Pro, because it's practically the same device, but it's smaller and it has half the amount of RAM. The big thing it has is Apple Pencil support. For me, this one is going to be solidly in C tier. It's okay. I get that I wanted a cheaper iPad Pro, and the Air 2 was aging at this point. They hadn't had a normal sized iPad in a while. So solid device, I think, but it wasn't anything special either. The 12.9-inch was definitely more impressive. Actually, you know what? I'm thinking D tier, because if you consider it to be its own device and you kind of leave the 2015 out of it, because they weren't released at the same time, it does look less impressive. It was just a slightly faster Air 2 with Apple Pencil support. So that would be it for 2016. We're moving into early 2017 with kind of the start of the modern iPad era. I guess you could say the iPad Pro really was. But now we have the iPad 5. That's right, 5 years later, it's back, baby. So the iPad 5 is kind of awesome. This was the first time Apple did a budget iPad, and I was absolutely thrilled with it. Why did I like it so much? $330 for a good iPad. That's why I liked it. A9 chipset, 2 gigs of RAM. It's somehow still supported on iPad OS 16, despite the fact that the iPhone 6s has the same specs and didn't get iOS 16. But yeah, it'll be supported for at least 6 years total. I doubt it gets the next update. And I loved the precedent of having a budget iPad. You don't have Apple Pencil support, the display isn't laminated, it's not as nice of a device, but I'll be darned if it ain't good value. So for me, I'm thinking B tier for the iPad 5. I wouldn't call it better than the iPad 4. I think that would be an exaggeration. And it was never meant to be super duper good or anything, because it was supposed to be a budget iPad, and it was. Okay, what else did we have in 2017? And this is where I really didn't need to split these two up. I've got the 10.5-inch 2017 Pro and the second gen 12.9-inch. So technically these are considered separate iPad Pros by Apple, which is why I did it. This is the only iPad Pro that was 10.5 inches, so it is technically its own thing. This was the only one that was 9.7 inches, so it's its own thing. I probably should have combined them as they came out at the same time, but that's fine. So these were very similar to the last Pro. The 10.5-inch had thinner bezels, which was nice, looking more similar to the 12.9-inch Pro. They had the A10X Fusion chipset, and they were really just a pretty basically refreshed iPad Pro. Nothing too mind-blowing. The smaller model did have 4 gigs of RAM now. The real special things about these, the only thing that makes them better than D tier, is that they were the first to have Pro Motion, 120 Hz, and that was awesome. So for that alone, they get to C tier in my opinion. Otherwise, they just weren't special, or they'd be higher, but 120 Hz for me was a really nice addition, and this is still a very solid iPad today. I know somebody who has one, and they absolutely love it, so definitely no real complaints with it. It wasn't a huge upgrade, and that's totally fine. In hindsight here, 120 Hz is a pretty big deal to me, so I probably should have put this one higher and the 2015 model a bit lower. I'd say the 2017 especially was the first time it really felt like a Pro iPad, but too late for that now, so it's fine. Okay, next up I think is probably the iPad 6. So this was simply essentially a follow-up to the iPad 5, also $330, brought the A10 chipset, but what it had was Apple Pencil support, and because of that, I think it's probably a B tier iPad. I'm now thinking maybe the iPad 5 should be C tier. I like that it was so budget, but not having Apple Pencil support, considering they came out with it a year later. I'm gonna bump the iPad 5 down to C tier, I think, because I think Apple Pencil support was a really good addition. The A10 Fusion chipset wasn't like that much better than the A9 or anything like that, and otherwise it was the same as the iPad 5. But if you're a student or somebody who wants a tablet for writing notes and want an Apple Pencil, the iPad 6 was just the obvious option, and the iPad 5 was kind of limited there. It feels weird putting the iPad 6 above these Pros, but keep in mind we're looking at value as a big part of this, how good they were for the time. The iPad 6 still supported today, of course. I guess we're at the 2018 iPad Pro. We're working through these, we're getting there. Okay, it's funny because we have all these iPads left, and we're only looking at the previous 4 years now. This is 4 years of iPads versus above that is what, 7 years of iPads? Just ridiculous how many have come out recently. And I combined the sizes too. So this is both 11 inches and 12.9 inches, and I called this the Pro 3. Technically speaking, Apple considers the 12.9 inch to be the third generation, but the 11 inch they call the first generation, because technically it was the first 11 inch iPad Pro. It's weird, that's why I combined them. And you can see down the line, I just ended up calling them after the Pro 4. They're the Pro M1 and the Pro M2, which I think is more straightforward. But anyways, this is going to be S tier. An updated design, they reduced the bezel sizes, they added Face ID, and I think it's a fantastic tablet. I still have this one myself. I got it refurbished a couple years back now, and it also had the Apple Pencil second generation, which was better in every single way. It magnetically charging on the side versus having to plug it in awkwardly. Huge difference. 2018 Pro was just fantastic. It had the A12 chipset. Future Josh, I do correct myself later, but it was actually the A12X. 120 hertz, of course. It was very thin. There was a bit of a bending controversy, but it's just because they were so thin and big. And I think it's pretty fair to call it a S tier device. The only issue is we don't know how it's going to age at this point yet. Obviously the Air 2 and the Air 1 to a lesser extent just aged so well over the years. The design is going to age amazingly for the 2018 Pro, but is it going to age as well with software support? We don't know yet. So this is where a little bit of guesswork starts to kind of enter the fray, especially with once we get to the 2022 iPads. But considering what the 2018 brought, I think that it's fair to have it there. So past that, what do we have? Well, we've got a couple iPads that came out in early 2019. iPad Air makes a return, everybody. Yay! So this was essentially a redo of the 10.5 inch Pro without 120 hertz. Otherwise, it was very similar. Apple Pencil 1 support. I bought the Air 3 at launch, actually. I wanted a tablet. I was in school at the time, university, and so I wanted a tablet to write things on, and so I got it, and I liked it. It was a pretty nice, solid tablet, and I think it did pretty well at that mid-tier price point before the iPad Pros. It also, however, wasn't exciting whatsoever, so I think C tier is probably good for it. It had the laminated display, and it looked sleeker, 10.5 inches. I'd imagine it had a better camera. I haven't talked hardly about the cameras at all, because when it comes to tablets, I just don't really care about the cameras. I know some people really do, but either way, I think the Air 3 is a solidly C tier device. Then we have another iPad making a return, the iPad Mini 5. I'm torn between D and E tier. Yeah, that seems low, right? The Mini 5 wasn't necessarily bad. It had Apple Pencil support, it had the same specs as the Air 3. It was essentially a smaller Air 3. The problem was the price point. This was $400. The iPad 6, and very soon after the iPad 7, was bigger, and $330. The value proposition was just not there whatsoever. I'm gonna stick it in E tier for now. Apple sold it until late 2021 as well, for the same price as 2019. So it's the same time as like the iPad 8, the Mini 5 was more expensive. So there's that. Yeah, that just all left a really bad taste in my mouth, and I'm glad it finally got an upgrade, even if I'm still not a huge fan of the price. So that's the 2019 Mini 5. Someone's gonna be mad at me for that. It's not that it was a bad tablet, it just represented a pretty poor value. Maybe it was okay value at launch, it certainly wasn't later on down the line. All right, and then late 2019, we had the iPad 7. Now the iPad 7 was nice in that it added a 10.2 inch display, so it wasn't quite as sleek as the iPad Air 3, but it did have thinner bezels, which was nice. It did also bring a smart keyboard connector for those who wanted that. It had the A10 again, so same chipset as the iPad 6. You are looking at 3 gigs of RAM versus 2 though, so that helps. For $330 at this point, you were getting a pretty darn legit iPad. The iPad 7 was a pretty solid addition in my opinion. I'm gonna stick it solidly in B tier for now. It was pretty darn sleek for $330. Actually, well, you know what? The A10 at this point is, what, almost 3 years old? So I'm gonna stick it in C tier. And you know what? I'm gonna knock the Air 3 down to D tier as well. Again, as I said, we'd be reevaluating this as we went along. I'm just like looking at it. It looks a little more balanced this way, but beyond just that, I think that's probably fair. And again, I liked the Air 3. It just wasn't that special. And the iPad 7, it looks sleeker, but older chipset. So C tier you go. Perfectly fine iPad. Just like the iPad 5, actually. I'd say that's probably about right. Okay, what's next? Well, you gonna answer me? Jeez, you guys are quiet today. Okay, we're at the iPad Pro 4, aka the 2nd generation 11-inch and the 4th generation 12.9-inch. That is why I combined them. This one is solidly E tier. This was a pretty pointless upgrade. So the biggest thing about it is you can see versus the 2018 there, the camera is bigger. They added a second camera lens. Beyond that though, it was practically the same device. It has the A12Z chip instead of the A12X, I think. Did I say A12X before? I don't think I did. You know what? Who cares? Okay, I'm not perfect. There's so many iPads, so many chipsets. Give me a break. I'm not looking forward to the comments on this video. It really wasn't a special iPad. The camera upgrade was pretty heavily focused on, but beyond that, I mean, it was just a very minorly refreshed Pro 3. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. It's just what came after it, not very long later, was so much better. I think they should have probably just waited. Anyway, so that's the iPad Pro 4. Okay, and then technically, I think we have the 8th generation iPad next. Right, so the iPad 8. Now, the iPad 8 was great because it brought the A12 chipset. It's also 10.2 inches, but $330 for an A12 device. Mind you, that processor is not far off from what's in the 2020 Pro. Should this one be as high as it is? Well, it was, man, this is hard. This is really hard, honestly. This has gotten quite difficult because I'm really not sure on some of these, but the iPad 8 is definitely a B tier device. A12 chipset, it looks sleek, $330. Absolutely fantastic value in my opinion. Then we have the iPad Air 4. This one is tough. So essentially, it looks like the 11-inch iPad Pro. It was $600, not that much cheaper than the 11-inch Pro. It has the A14 chipset, which is good. There's no Face ID. It still has the Touch ID sensor, but in the power button, which was an interesting decision on their part. Laminated display, 2nd generation Apple Pencil support. The biggest difference between it and the Pro is that it doesn't have 120 Hz. It also has USB-C and dropped the headphone jack, which I never like. I actually forgot to mention that with the Pro 3. I like USB-C a lot though, so almost willing to give it a pass. My biggest issue of the Air 4, I didn't like the price raise at the time. I'm gonna stick it in D tier. I don't think it's a bad iPad. I just think it's a weird one. I don't see why you wouldn't just pay a little bit extra and get the 11-inch iPad Pro. I liked all the colors. I liked the design. I like being able to use the 2nd gen Apple Pencil, but the 120 Hz for me is a big difference. It makes the experience feel so much smoother. It is weird seeing this as like D tier 2019 and the difference between them in design, but don't forget they did raise the price. So there's gonna be so many people mad at me. Okay, next up is yeah, the M1 iPad Pro. I am a fan of this one. Anything with the M1 chipset in it is good by me. The fact that this thing runs a laptop chipset with Apple's silicon is just amazing. This solidly for me is going to be A tier. The only reason it's not S tier is because the design is the same. It didn't really change much besides the processor, but that's okay because it's a fantastic device. And so I think solidly A tier is deserved. I just took about 30 seconds of being silent there, just like reconsidering some of my choices, because that's a lot in A tier, but I wouldn't really change it. I don't know, like it's nostalgically, I want to say, sure, the 2011 iPad 2 is better than the 2015 iPad Pro, but practically speaking, for the time, Apple Pencil, huge display in a time where tablets were quite stale. I don't know, it's my list, don't judge, or do judge, I mean, that's kind of the point, but you can make your own, right? It's in the description, go make your own if you don't like it. Go post it on the Discord, I might even look at it. Then you've got the Mini 6. 2nd gen Apple Pencil support, and finally you're improving upon that horrible value that the Mini 5 had. I'm gonna stick this one in C tier. This one's still being sold. I think if you want a mini tablet, it's about as good as it gets. Honestly, it is a very, very good device. It's not like it rocks the boat. It's not higher than C tier, but it's not lower either. Okay, iPad 9. Now the iPad 9. What did the iPad 9 bring again? Man, there's so many of them. So as usual, I always like the budget iPads. We're gonna stick this solidly in B tier. A13 chipset, which at this point was 2 years old, but is still very fast. Don't forget, the way the chipsets have scaled in previous years, like they just keep getting better and better to the point that a processor from 3 years ago, 4 years ago, is still very good today. This one upgraded the base storage to 64 gigabytes. The camera is quite old at this point. I think it's the same camera as in the iPad Air 2 from 2014, which is kind of brutal. But I mean, as I said, I don't care about the camera on tablets. $330, you're getting a very, very capable machine. Definitely faster than any any like laptop I think you get for 300 bucks. Absolutely. Also, it had a 12 megapixel front camera. I almost forgot about that. Yeah, there's still a 1.2 megapixel in the iPad 8, which is actually pretty brutal. It almost deserves to be knocked down for that. I'm gonna knock the iPad 7 to D tier and the iPad 8 to C tier is what I'm gonna do, because I forgot about the 1.2 megapixel camera. That's kind of unacceptable for 2020. Maybe I don't care about the camera, but that's pretty bad. So I think that's a little bit more fair. And so that's that for the iPad 9, and that's the final home button iPad. It looks like we'll never get another one considering 2022, which you can see at the bottom there. We're almost done. Okay, so for these iPads, the Air 5 got announced first, and it brings the Apple M1 chipset, which is maybe overkill, maybe? It's kind of awesome. Still not 120 hertz. I really wish they would put at least 90 hertz in there. Upgrades the selfie camera. Still has Touch ID. Overall, just a solid tablet. $600. I'm not huge on the value. I still think the Pro is worth going up to, especially now that it has the M2 chipset. But I don't think it's awful. It's certainly no worse than the Air 4, so I think I'll stick it in D tier, because the design was already established 2 years prior. It's the exact same design. It just brings some nice quality of life improvements. So that's the iPad Air 5. You know, it's kind of nice that they're still doing these technically old iPads. Like, you still have the Air, you still have the regular iPad. iPad Pro's, I guess, only 7 years old, which is actually quite old. All right, so well, now that I feel old, we'll talk about the iPad Pro M2. Simple upgrade. Adds the M2 chipset. That's the big thing. Wait, when did LiDAR come in? Do I care? I've never cared. They always focus on the augmented reality, and I just like tune out that part of the presentations, to be honest. So at this point, you know what to expect with these iPad Pros. They really haven't changed that much from the 2018 model, besides being just faster internally. The M2 is insane. It's an 8-core CPU. You've got a 10-core GPU. It starts with 128 gigs. You've got 8 or 16 gigs of RAM. Pro Motion is still fantastic. That gorgeous XDR display. I'm gonna stick it in B tier. The only thing I don't like about it is how expensive they are, and it makes sense that they're so expensive. How could they not be? They're literally like MacBook specs, and 800 bucks for the 11 inches, and that's only $200 more than the Air. I'm gonna say B tier, because Apple Silicon is just so impressive. I'm gonna say B tier. What you can do with iPads these days is really, really good, and when you take into account iPad OS, it's getting a lot better. It's definitely not as good as the first M1 or anything, just because the M1 was such a jump, but it's a solid iPad. Just expensive. I wouldn't pay that. But I also don't need it. Then you have the iPad 10. Oh boy. This one I've got some opinions on. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of the iPad 10. This is a very recent iPad, so it's still pretty relevant to talk about it. The iPad 10 ruins for me what the budget iPad was. There's a reason they're all ranked between what, D to B tier. They're all good. They're not fantastic, but they don't need to be. They're $330. That's the whole point, is they're $330. They have the home button, which I think was a really good way to go, because some people just want a home button. They don't want the full screen design. They don't care. They want something they're familiar with, something that's simple. And I think they could have kept doing that older design for a bit longer. And so while this isn't going to be a bad tablet by any means, I actually think it's probably going to be very good, and people who get it are going to really enjoy it. It's F tier. Home button's gone, Touch ID's in the power button, that's fine. Same as the iPad Air. Unlike the iPad Air, it doesn't have 2nd generation Apple Pencil support, okay? That's odd considering the design. You would think it would suit it. All right, well, whatever. 1st gen Apple Pencil, you know, you have to charge it awkwardly. Yeah, that's even worse now, because get this, it moved to USB-C. Goodbye headphone jack. And also goodbye not using a dongle to charge your Apple Pencil, because it plugs in with Lightning, and so they have to include a bloody freaking dongle for you to charge your pencil. It's beyond stupid. No laminated display, more expensive. I like the colors a lot. They actually remind me a lot of the iPod Touch 5, which I really dig the colors. I won't lie about that one. But $450 for the Wi-Fi model is too much. It's just a pointless tablet, and I really hate it. I really hate the direction Apple's heading here. Again, it's not that it's a bad tablet itself. It's fast, A14 chipset. They have 5G networking now, wow. They upgraded the camera stuff. I would have rather they had given it Apple Pencil 2 support. See, if they had done Apple Pencil 2 support, I could have lived with this. It's just the silliest, darndest thing ever. So yeah, that's my tier list here. I am very curious to see the comments. Also very scared. Let's see, any last minute adjustments? I think the iPad 10 and F is going to be a little bit controversial, but I'm just, oh man, Apple really ticked me off with that one. It's just bad. It's just bad. 2017 iPad 5 C tier. Yeah, I mean, it's mini C. You know what? I'm done. I'm done. I'm not gonna touch it anymore. I could keep talking myself out of certain things all day. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what I think, but I'm very curious to see your guys' tier lists, so make sure you make them and post them on the Discord. Again, the link to that is in the description. So yeah, thanks for watching. Comment, what was your first tablet? How about that? What was your first tablet you ever had? I bet a lot of people are just random obscure Android tablets that half of us have never heard of. But anyways, yeah, so that's it. Social medias, Discords, Apple guy behind me. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.